I'm Catherine Statler. I'm professor of history and the Element Chair for Collaborative Research at the Humanities Center. And I want to welcome you to this very special and prestigious event in our semester's programming, the Knapp Lecture, delivered today by our distinguished guest, Dr. Melvin Rogers. So welcome, Dr. Rogers. So I just want to give you a little bit of history because I am a historian. The Knapp Chair of Liberal Arts was established in 1995 by a generous endowment from the estate of Mary and Churchill Knapp of La Jolla, California, longtime supporters of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD. Knapp chairs are distinguished teacher scholars who are appointed by the dean and represent the arts and humanities, natural sciences and mathematics, and social sciences. The Knapp chairs contribute to the vitality and centrality of liberal arts in the college by teaching and interacting with students, collaborating with faculty, and presenting public lectures, such as this one, that engage our campus and community in confronting humanity's urgent challenges. And now, to introduce our current Knapp chair, please welcome Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations and Director of Africana Studies, Dr. Corey Gooding.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Sorry, I'm all about the call and response. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I like that. Thank you. And thank you very much, Dr. Statler. It is my honor to welcome you all tonight to the Illume Speaker Series Knapp Lecture on James Baldwin, Racial Progress Without Redemption, presented by Dr. Melvin L. Rogers. This event is made possible in part by the Humanities Center, which is dedicated to the exploration of the human condition and the limitless ways in which human beings understand and interact with our world. The talk represents the culmination of a wide range of activities organized around faculty, student, and community engagement with Dr. Melvin Rogers and his work. We've had an extraordinary 2 weeks having him join us here. The Knapp program is made possible through the support of Dean Noel Norton, who provides thoughtful and vocal leadership on the importance of the liberal arts. Thank you, Dean Norton. Also, I want to recognize the extraordinary partners in the Humanities Center, particularly Assistant Director Lindy Villa, Director Brian Clack, and Program Coordinator Maggie McRae for helping to create this space and this opportunity. I'd also like to thank the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and particularly Executive Assistant Emily Farrell, and our wonderful chair, Dr. Casey Dominguez. This program, to bring our guests to San Diego for the last 2 weeks, would not be possible either without my co-conspirators, Dr. Jennifer Tillman, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations, Timothy McCarty, Dr. Timothy McCarty. I'd also like to thank all of the countless students and faculty who participated in these activities and all the folks who helped to pull these spaces together for us. Now, on to our guest speaker. Dr. Melvin Rogers is the Edna and Richard Salomon Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Associate Director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University, and clearly this spring, our 2025 Knapp Chair for the Liberal Arts here at USD. He received his MPhil in Political Thought and Intellectual History from Cambridge in 2000 and a PhD in Political Science from Yale University in 2006. Professor Rogers has wide-ranging interests in contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African-American political thought. He has edited the book John Dewey, The Public and Its Problems, and African-American Political Thought, A Collected History, where he and his co-editor bring together an impressive collection of 30 essays on figures in the tradition of African American political thought. Professor Rogers now serves as the co-editor of Oxford University Press's New Histories of Philosophy series, which attends to the unstudied resources in the history of philosophy, with a particular effort to build the list in Africana philosophy. He's the author of The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, and The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. Now, let me show you what this looks like so y'all can go out and grab a copy. All right, just want to make sure you get the right book. Now, just a little bit about this book. It's an ambitious account of the profound ways African Americans have reimagined democracy. The Darkened Light of Faith offers invaluable lessons about how to grapple with racial injustice and make democracy work. It is the winner of the Ralph J. Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association, the winner of the David Easton Award for Foundations of Political Theory section from the American Political Science Association, and winner of the Best Book Award in American Political Thought section from the American Political Science Association. His articles appear in major academic journals and popular venues such as Dissent, The Atlantic, Public Seminar, and Boston Review. The man is prolific and extraordinary in his work, and we are excited to welcome here. Please help me in welcoming him up to the stage.
I am absolutely humbled by the opportunity to be here. As I said to Corey, you all could have invited someone else. And so it means a great deal when you say, I like this work, let's bring him here, and I want to share my colleagues with him, because I have had an extraordinary time being in conversation with faculty and students across this university. So I want to thank Corey. I want to thank all of those that have been involved in bringing me here. I obviously want to thank, there's always invisible labor that makes these things possible, right? The mics, food, and these kinds of things. So I want to thank them as well. So one of the things that has been quite striking about being here is, for me, the weather. There's a way in which that weather, it shields you from the darkness that currently defines our condition. So we need, for a moment, at least that's what this lecture will do, break through the sun so we can see the darkness on the other side, the darkness of our present, the darkness of our past. I find myself, perhaps like many of you, deeply unsettled, to say the least, by our current moment. Trumpism has seized the nation, and Democrats, at least as I see it, seem either unprepared or unwilling to respond. We continue to frame this moment in terms of partisan politics or political polarization, but that framing is mistaken. We are broken, and that defies polarization. At its core, Trumpism is racial resentment, the belief that racial progress comes at the expense of white Americans, that racial progress is not about redeeming society, but reversing harms now directed toward white Americans. Of course, there's more to Trumpism than this. But one response, we see it all around us, is a refusal to confront our racial past. We refuse, as Abraham Lincoln warned, to recognize that we cannot escape our history. Lately, I've been searching for resources, not simply to understand Trumpism, but to understand our broader tendency on both the left and the right to seek racial redemption through our politics. This impulse is dangerous. Even among the well-intentioned, it distorts our ability to do right by justice, to meet democracy's demand that we honor the freedom and equal standing of our fellows. Our illusions and evasions, our belief in our own exceptionalism, our nostalgic longing for a past that never was, make America great again. These habits will always present our vices as virtues and in the process deform both us and the nation. It's in this context that I want to turn to two figures that will be the central focus of my reflections this evening. I want to turn, and I'll explain why, I want to turn to the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal and the American novelist and essayist James Baldwin. Now, in turning to Myrdal, I want to examine, and I want you all to walk with me, I want to examine a form of racial liberalism that shaped the latter half of the 20th century. And I want to explore what I will call its deformed aspirational politics. We see this most vividly in An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy of 1944, where Myrdal deploys, he uses liberal ideals and ideas, freedom, equal regard, and social justice. He uses these to confront the persistence of racial inequality. From the 1940s through the 1960s, racial liberalism informed social, legal, and economic reform in the United States. And Myrdal stands as a defining figure in this tradition. His vision interprets the nation's racial past through a redemptive arc, one that assumes the inevitable realization of racial justice in the United States. What we see in American Dilemma is a once-born liberalism with little room for sin, little room for tragedy, little room for trauma. What I want to do is expose the aspirational politics that animate his work and the deeper attitude that sustains it. It is an attitude of evasion. It is an attitude that is still with us today. Against the backdrop of Myrdal, I focus on one of the most critical responses of the period to this kind of racial liberalism, the thinking of James Baldwin. His writings captured the public imagination and shamed the political establishment as the Black freedom struggle was coming clearly into view in the early 1960s. And I turn to Baldwin because in him, I think we find a kind of attenuated aspirational politics, born as it was from seeing both the promises and the betrayals of American life. In his writings, we discover his confrontation with the irrevocable deeds of white supremacy, and yet the necessity of responding to it all the same, because at last we are responsible for the society to which we belong. To call it irrevocable is to focus on the soul-scarring character of white supremacy, for which, as Baldwin says, neither he nor time nor history will ever forgive. So I reach for Baldwin in these Trumpian times because his reckoning with the nation's scarred soul offers us something we desperately need: a way to think about who we are, our history, and a way to think about how to manage ideas of forgiveness, responsibility, and redemption, how to manage those things in relation to our past. If Myrtle offers us an attitude of evasion, one that persists in our politics today, Baldwin offers us an ethic of historical accountability. And I hope to persuade you that being critically responsive to history demands much more than we often allow ourselves to admit. So there is the journey before us. We begin with Myrtle. Along the way, we'll encounter some other characters, but we'll walk together, we'll find our way, and if we get lost, we'll get lost together, and that'll be okay. Myrtle's An American Dilemma represented a major statement on race and inequality when it was published in 1944. The Carnegie Corporation, who commissioned the study in 1938, doubted that Americans could be or would be objective when it came to race. So they selected the Swedish economist Myrtle, who had already established himself as a pioneering intellectual. And he, in turn, enlisted some of the most gifted scholars of race in the fields of history, sociology, economics, and political science. In the study, American Dilemma, Myrtle embraces a specific kind of moralism latent in American life. He opens and closes the massive study, parts 1 and 11, respectively, by framing the problem of racial inequality in terms of the crisis of moral commitment among white Americans and what he considered to be their betrayal of the American creed. This moralism of the text remains the most enduring part of that book, which is more than 1,000 pages. The politics of the day and for several decades thereafter drew support from this study. The framing of any book matters a great deal. The decision by Myrtle to structure the book in the way he did shapes how we ought to understand the underlying ideological commitments of the United States, the history of racial disregard, and the role of white Americans in responding to this problem. The book aspires to tell an origin story about who Americans are. And origin stories are very interesting kinds of things. They do important existential work for those who subscribe to them. Because origin stories often transcend time, they permit us to rediscover a primordial national moment. Here at ground zero of the nation's life, we discover what the polity's true commitments are. Origin stories have a divine, a mythical, privileged character that dominates what's derived from them. Origin stories are powerful precisely because they are about fate. You pick your superhero and let them try and defy their origin story and see what happens. Origin stories are about fate. They give you direction and they give you purpose. It is unsurprising then that Myrtle begins in the very first chapter with what he calls, quote, the origin of the American creed. Behind racial inequality in the United States, he wants us to believe we discover a true community that beckons us, a vision of American identity in its pure form. That pure identity is one that is committed to freedom and equal regard, a creed that says everyone is worthy of respect and the opportunity to chart their own course so long as it is consistent with the ability of others to do the same. The pure form of American identity and Myrtle's Myrtle's religious belief that American democracy is fated to win the battle against white supremacy brings to my mind, William James's classic account of the once-born soul. Here's our first new character. Why turn to James? The once-born soul, when James uses it, it's a heuristic. It is a heuristic, I think, that best captures something about Myrdal's liberalism. Heuristics are interesting things. They simplify thought, streamlining our view of the world, but they can often be too neat. And that is, in fact, the problem. The American creed simplifies reality in just this way. And at its core lies a certain kind of character, a certain kind of soul that one would call, or that I want to call, the once-born soul. In his Varieties of Religious Experience of 1902, James distinguishes between two ideal types, once-born and twice-born souls. He acknowledges in that text that most of us are of a mixed variety. But what is of significance is that these different types of souls embody different attitudes toward life. The firstborn has a healthy-minded attitude and often, quote, looks on all things and sees that they are good, James says. In the systematic variety of healthy-mindedness, the once-born soul, quote, selects some one aspect of the world as its essence for the time being, and disregards the rest. To resist humanity's constant struggle and violation of its own highest image, the once-born consistently retreats to a positive feature of human nature and claim that feature of human nature to be the essence of what it means to be a human being. In contrast, James says the twice-born soul sees both the light and the persistence of the dark features of human nature. The doctrine of the twice-born, James says, quote, holds as it does more of the element of evil in solution is the wider and completer view. Now, James's point is not that the once-born soul cannot acknowledge evil. That's not the point. His point is that evil factors as an anomaly in human life, and thus the once-born is prevented from accepting evil as a real and durable trait of human nature. As James says of the once-born, quote, the world is a sort of one-storied affair whose accounts are kept in one denomination, whose parts have just the values which naturally they appear to have. The once-born, as he says, lives on the plus side of life. The textual echo of the once-born lives in an American dilemma, but to notice it, we must track Myrdal's description of the problem. In the introduction of An American Dilemma, this is how Myrdal understands the problem. The American Negro problem is a problem in the heart of the American. It is there that the interracial tension has its focus. It is there that the decisive struggle goes on. This is the central viewpoint of this treatise. At bottom, our problem is a moral dilemma of the American, the conflict between his moral valuations, his moral values on various levels of consciousness. Now, what does all of this amount to? Essentially, he is saying that white Americans are pulled in two directions. On the one hand, they believe in freedom and equality, which defines the American creed, yet on the other, there are a variety of prejudices against African Americans that betray the creed. For him, each white American carries within their breast this tension, and it dogs their psyche, and it wreaks havoc on the external community in which Black Americans attempt to live out their lives. But despite this despite this description, Myrtle maintains that the American creed, and this is his language, is, quote, the morally higher and true value that directs political society. Notice this is Myrtle isolating what he takes to be the essence of American life, as the once born often does. He treats the history of racial domination as an aberration within American life and thus set about the task of elucidating to the citizens of the United States their true commitments. Myrtle partitions the past between those features that truly convey American ideals and those that reflect anomalies within the national identity. And this is why he says, quote, in principle, the Negro problem was settled long ago, end quote. For him, the scope of freedom was clear, the conditions of equality were properly understood, but the application of these things was limited. Because we got the values right. Myrtle's text is not merely descriptive. It articulates an aspiration. His elevated notion of our national identity whispers, even today you can hear it, to our soul like ministering angels, and comforts the heart. So it is not surprising that American Dilemma became a text not only for the academic, but for the lay public as well. Abridged versions of an American Dilemma were printed in the 40s and 50s and 60s, circulated not merely among academics, but the lay public. And when you read an American Dilemma, it is filled with examples both interpersonal and structural of white supremacy and black domination. But these examples inhabit the text in a particular way and shape how the nation should think about its identity amid racial inequality. Ultimately, narrating the American Dilemma works by fragmenting not what we remember, but how we remember it. The past flows away from us into the gutter of our horrible deeds, giving us the impression that they form no part of our shared identity, that they do not, in fact, touch the nation's soul. The details of the past of racial discrimination and inequality, are called forth and seemingly shape the present, but Myrtle is very careful. He sequesters them, allowing Americans to say in the 1940s, as we so often say today, that is not who we are. What do we mean when we say that? Particularly when it's related to the persistence of racial inequality. We mean that there is a real way for us to be, and that what is on display now in the persistence of racial inequality somehow is not who we are. He encourages his readers to take comfort that the vision of life on display in the 1940s is not theirs. He sanctions the thought that the prejudices that constrain black life are not also of America's will. Ever on a quest for an unsullied political identity, Myrtle ironically deforms our way of seeing the full picture of our humanity. And in that deformation, he leaves us less than human, less responsive to our shared, even if tragic, inheritance, and less attuned as a result to the sources of racial injustice, sources that are here in us. At precisely this moment, we can hear James Baldwin's worry 2 decades later in his 1964 essay, The White Problem. Here is Baldwin. What is most terrible is that American white men are not prepared to believe my version of the story in order to avoid believing that They have set up in themselves a fantastic system of evasions, denials, and justifications, a system that is about to destroy their grasp of reality, which is another way of saying destroy their moral sense. When Baldwin talks about the system of evasions, he often talks about it as Americans' insistence on their innocence. Now, Baldwin uses innocence throughout his work to diagnose the refusal of Americans to face their racial history. Innocence denotes attitude and point of view, which, as Baldwin argues, shapes the cultural horizon in which both Black and white Americans live. Innocence involves closing one's eyes to others in their historical particularity to affirm an alternative and false reality. The person standing in front of us represents a history. And innocence, on Baldwin's account, is about closing one's eyes to the history that is represented in the person in front of us. So what precisely is the false reality? He names it in the same essay of 1964. Here now, he's talking about the nation. The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man, but since they were Christian and since they had already decided they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble. I'm going to come back toward the end to this language of fatal flaw. But the thing we should pay attention to is what Baldwin detects, what he finds here. He finds the attitude of evasion at work. To confront Black pain and death involves acknowledging something about one's community. Acknowledgement shatters illusions, something Baldwin argues is a difficult, even if necessary, thing for society to do. And here is the difficulty. The danger, he tells us, in the Fire Next Time of 1963, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of reality. Behind this remark is Baldwin's ongoing confrontation with the way identity works in the United States. The way identity works as both a form of estrangement and deformation. What do I mean here? If Baldwin tries to enable Black people to see their white counterparts, he also seeks to describe to white Americans the illusions that grip them and the cause. So his preoccupation with identity is also a call for his fellows to be suspicious of how they think of themselves. Estrangement is about how the meaning of American identity evades historical inheritance, evades its historical inheritance. You are estranged from your past. When white Americans narrate the meaning of the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, or the election of the first African-American president, these stories function as instances of the nation's latent commitments manifest. The power of America's origin story, writing the course of events. These moments in American history are not interpreted, as Baldwin would encourage us to do, as deep criticisms of and tensions within the complicated identity of the nation. And for that reason, the nation does not interpret them as departures, let's say, from the founders' commitments. They do not, in other words, show us a scarred nation attempting to be born again. All of those instances are read as consistent and fulfilling the vision of the founders. And thus, we're unable to see the tensions and fractures at the core of that identity, the ways in which the election, for example, of the first African-American president, in fact, marks a departure from what the founders intended, but it reflected a nation attempted to be born again as it grapples with its racial history. So I said something about estrangement. Let me say a word about deformation. Deformation of our ethical capacities, what Baldwin called the moral sense, is a result, a consequence of our estrangement. He argues that the intensity of one's attachment to the innocence of American life matches the ease with which one abdicates responsibility for the communities to which one belongs. People who imagine, he writes a year later in 1965, that history flatters them are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pen and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. Our ethical capacities matter not merely because they make us attuned to the world, but also because we find our ability to remake the world in that very attunement. What does that mean? Well, if I look at you and I focus on your history, your identity, the person that's standing in front of me, I become alive to the ways in which that identity is making a claim on me. It's asking for something, requesting something, insisting on something. But if I misdescribe the person in front of me and their identity in order to make myself feel comfortable, I in turn deform my moral sense. Because now I'm not alive, perceptually attuned, ready to be responsive to my fellows. This is what Baldwin means when he's talking about estrangement and deformation. There is, I think, behind this point, a striking claim that Baldwin wants to make about the political goals of the United States. As a form of estrangement, American identity also evades democratic freedom. Now that should sound odd to you. We're all about freedom. Baldwin says otherwise. For him, freedom is always positive. It requires cultural and institutional support. It depends on being recognized in ways that enable one to pursue life plans without fear of arbitrary power. Each one of us, right now, in this place, we depend on relationships, institutions, to help complete the vision of life that we plan for ourselves. And if that's right, we are inescapably dependent on each other to realize freedom. But that dependency also involves vulnerability, potentially revealing the inadequacies or limitations of the institutions to which we belong, yes, but sometimes it reveals the inadequacies and limitations of our very identities. Our identities are getting in the way of us flourishing. However necessary, freedom turns out to be a hard thing to bear for those that claim innocence. Here is the rub, and however obvious it may seem, we must never tire of saying it and encouraging each other to accept its truth. The things to which one must attend do not disappear because we close our eyes. And the inherited costs display themselves in the form of reinscribed harms that demand a response, one way or another. This point of view gives us a different take on the narration of American history I mentioned earlier. Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power, the election of the first Black president. These were not merely sites of transformation in the United States. If we pay attention to them carefully, they represent the trauma of a nation. The trauma of a nation that's haunting it, demanding that it be properly responsive to it. So what do? I just want to check my time. You all okay? All right. I got to check on you periodically, because I get going with this stuff. I'm not even paying attention to y'all. So what do? Well, Baldwin says nothing short of a rebirth is required, a reawakening by embracing the nation's traumas as also what the nation is. Baldwin's plea is that Americans assume a different attitude, critically embrace their past, and allow both to structure a collective vision of responsibility. But just as Myrtle's view involved a picture of innocence against which Baldwin railed, I want to suggest that Myrtle's view also involved a narrow conception of responsibility, inadequate to the fullness of history. So we got all of this history bearing down on us. We need an account of responsibility about how to understand our relationship to it, what we owe to it. So Baldwin, I think, offers us more, unsurprisingly. But to see it, I want to take us to a scene in American history. It's 1963. It's before a live audience. And around the table, you have James Baldwin. You have the sociologist Nathan Glaser. You have the American philosopher Sidney Hook. And you have Myrtle. And they're gathered for Commentaries Magazine Symposium, Liberalism and the Negro. Commentary is a monthly magazine founded by the American Jewish Committee in 1945, quite popular and important by the 1960s. By the 1970s, it begins to shift toward a kind of neoconservatism. The symposium was subsequently published in 1964, marking the 20th anniversary of Myrtle's American Dilemma. The symposium was intended to take stock of how the United States has progressed or had progressed since the 1944 tax. And when you read the symposium, one immediately notices that Baldwin stands apart from America's liberal defenders. But the focal point of tension is not between Baldwin and Myrtle, which you might have expected given the way I began. And the tension is not between Baldwin and Glaser. The heart of the disagreement is between James Baldwin and American philosopher Sidney Hook. There is a side story about why that should be very funny. And if you ask me, I will tell it to you. So behind Hook's engagement with Baldwin is a broader concern that Hook has about the role of history in thinking about ethical and political life. How should we understand the harms of the past in relation to our development as a nation moving forward? Hook tells the audience that the ethical principles of American life, by which he means the Declaration of Independence, must guide society. He says there is much to do to improve the life and standing of African Americans, but he insists there is little doubt that the nation has made and will continue to make progress. And then he directs his ire toward Baldwin. By all accounts, at this moment, around the table, Sidney Hook literally shifts his body toward Baldwin. And he says to Baldwin that to argue otherwise about the nation making progress, to argue otherwise would be, as Hooke says, to paralyze the ethical and political impulses of the nation. Throughout the exchange, Hooke seems more consistent with Myrtle than Myrtle himself at this point. Hooke leans into an ideological defense of liberal democracy that is indistinguishable from his affection, his appreciation for the United States. To him, Baldwin looked more like the social protest novelist Richard Wright, and Hooke had already criticized him and others in 1949 for advancing negative critiques of the United States. This ideological context and Hooke's politics of vindication shaped his attitude toward the past in thinking about racial justice and his account of responsibility. Here now are the words of Sidney Hooke. Quote, "Those people in the South are not responsible for the initial acts which develop the situation in which they find themselves. They can be charged with responsibility for not playing a greater role, for not taking a more active part in the political process, but there's a tremendous difference between responsibility for a problem which we run away from and collective guilt for the crimes of racists." Now, I want you to note two things about this. The first thing is, and this is consistent with something Hooke says elsewhere, Sidney Hooke conceives of the problem of race as, using his language, the Negro problem. And if, in his mind, it is the Negro problem, he thinks that it adheres in, it's a part of them. It's true, he says, that society should be involved in helping them along. But this is, as he insists several more times, the Negro problem. Notice that if you see this as the Negro problem, you will take for granted the institutions to which they belong. You will see those institutions as quite fine, because remember, the problem adheres in African Americans. The second thing I want you to notice is that Hooke assumes that responsibility requires direct culpability, that we are only responsible for actions that emerge from our will, right? That you can trace back from an action that you're claimed to be responsible for back to something you did. And because of that thinking, it leads Hooke to say, they were racist then, we are not now, and our responsibility extends no further than the actions we in the present have committed. History remains in this account, but its role is diminished, lest we endanger, as he says, our ethical and political impulses, lest we paralyze ourselves and our ability to engage in ethical and political transformation. If the American creed is a once-born faith because it has little space for lasting anguish and little patience for the specters of the past, Baldwin's account is very different. Baldwin argues that the way to a new America must run through the trauma of Black life, a twice-born faith in William James's sense that does not remit the nation's failures, but hold promises and betrayals, both of them clearly in view. Baldwin famously alerts his readers to this in The Fire Next Time, which I briefly referred to earlier. This line can find no home in Hooke's remarks. Quote, "This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of Black lives." Baldwin's point is that destruction not only happened, but it continues anew. Destruction is happening every day. To speak as he does indicates that Baldwin is not merely interested in us recalling past events. It is not a question of memory, he explains in 1955. The man does not remember the hand that struck him, Baldwin insists, the darkness that frightened him as a child. Nevertheless, the hand and the darkness remain with him, indivisible from himself forever, part of the passion that drives him whenever he thinks to take flight and seek the light. To stand in close relation to the past is to recognize how it shapes our identity and informs the judgments expressed in words and deed. The foundational role Baldwin grants the past, the importance he accords history may, in fact, unsettle some of us. His writings carry an Old Testament sensibility where failures in history weigh on the present. And anxiety about blame and guilt will likely arise whenever we are asked to take responsibility for the past. And here I'm reminded of something that Senator, he's not yet former, but he's not going to run again, but Senator Mitch McConnell said in 2019. Mitch McConnell was reflecting on reparations. And he says, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently live and are responsible, is a good idea. For a society preoccupied with innocence and that thinks of responsibility through a model of culpability, Baldwin will appear to be asking us to take the fall for something we did not do and over which we had no control. We heard this point in Sidney Hook. That's what Hook was saying to Baldwin. And we can hear it again in Baldwin's 1970 exchange with the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead. Baldwin urges Mead to consider our connection across time and how the past may bind us. And she resists. This is what Mead says. I think if one takes that position, it's absolutely hopeless. I will not accept any guilt for what anybody else did. I will only accept guilt for what I did, what I know emanated from my will. Her reasoning is quite blunt. If we can't control it, we're not guilty. Despite Baldwin's claims, he's not interested in blame or guilt. People typically don't listen to Baldwin, but here's Baldwin. I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. I know you didn't do it, and I didn't do it either. And to Mead's concern, he says, but I'm not trying to make us guilty. Similar to Hook and Mead, Baldwin is also after responsibility, but it is of a different kind. Here's Baldwin again, but I'm responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it too. The it here, of course, is the racial nightmare of American life. I think at just this moment, Baldwin's insights shine through, but it requires us to keep a connection I made earlier in view. This connection I made between freedom and dependency. Remember, all of us depend on each other, institutions, to help complete our freedom. We depend on a kind of socio-institutional ecology that creates ethical and political conditions for completing our freedom, for helping us to realize the plans of life that we set for ourselves. Without a healthy ecosystem, injustice persists, obstructing freedom's realization. For Baldwin, this is not merely a structural institutional problem. Injustice is also reproduced within us through our habits and sensibilities. And institutions have a way of shaping our identity, and our identity has a way of shaping institutions. The reproduction of racial injustice across time requires, he argues, a corresponding capacious idea of responsibility to match. What Baldwin is after is a view of shared or collective responsibility. Shared responsibility is a responsibility I personally bear, but I do not bear it alone. I bear it in the awareness that others bear it with me. Acknowledgement of my responsibility is also acknowledgement of the inchoate collective of which I am a part, which together produces injustices, even if those injustices were initiated well before we arrived on the scene. Our racial history thus requires that we view responsibility as also something we can share, even when we cannot causally see such acts of injustices flowing directly from our will. So Baldwin thinks we awaken our responsibility by holding the nightmare in view. Hook suggests otherwise. Hook thinks the American creed can only survive by being released from its burdens. This is what a great many of us think today. The attack on DEI, the attack on the kinds of books that are in circulation in colleges and especially K through 12 emanates from this desire to unburden. And in some ways, it emanates from something else. An inability to trust that Black and, yes, white students can read these things and bear it. Hook and Myrtle were uninterested in asking the question that Baldwin thought we must ask. How should we stand to the irrevocable deed of white supremacy? What is the fate of responsibility in a democratic society given the brutal history of racial inequality? What is left of aspirational politics if you allow race and its history to bear down on you in just the way I've been suggesting? So let's now bring this to a close. You all still with me? All right. So there's one lingering issue to address. I just mentioned it. It has to do with the weightiness of our history. And it comes in the form of some language I've used at the beginning and throughout. It comes in the form of the very notion of an irrevocable deed. For if deeds are irrevocable, if actions are irrevocable, and their consequences seem to extend into the present, it's not exactly clear why one would ever attempt to respond. One might worry that how Baldwin asks us to think about the past threatens to endanger the very notion of aspirational politics, because after all, if the deed is irrevocable, then it's not clear aspirational politics. In fact, aspirational politics can't do anything in response to it. His claim in The Fire Next Time that the country's crimes against Black people are something for which he, nor time, nor history can ever forgive, or his insistence in The White Problem that the act of enslavement was the country's fatal flaw, seems to deny the possibility of transformation, of progress. The reason we are likely to think this is because of how we have historically envisioned politics. For if aspirational politics holds out the possibility of change and progress where racial justice is concerned, it must be because the nation can redeem itself through its politics. Progress, we so often think, must imply salvation. It must imply absolution. Well, Baldwin is asking you to see this matter differently. To take Baldwin seriously requires us to disentangle transformation and progress from redemption talk. This is not a tactic, it isn't a program, it is, at the end of the day, an attitude or mood that nurtures democracy and tries to sustain the citizenry for an incomplete and, dare I say, perhaps incompletable journey. I don't think Baldwin says to Hook in that roundtable discussion, I don't think we can discuss the ethical character of the nation properly unless we begin at the beginning. When he asks us to return to the beginning and the weightiness of our past, he asks us to think of the nation, here's our last character, as Osiah Royce once thought of an individual that wrecked their moral universe. Here is how Royce put it in that extraordinary text of 1913, The Problem of Christianity. Listen to this. The example is of a person who wrecked their moral universe. In his own deed, he has been false to whatever light he then and there had, and to whatever ideal he then viewed as his highest good. Hereupon, no new deed, however good or however faithful, and however much of worthy consequences it introduces into the future life of the traitor or of his world, can annul the fact that the one traitorous deed was actually done. There is no good that can be introduced that will annul the traitorous deed. For Baldwin, the deeds are the enslavement of black people and the corresponding hierarchy of value we call white supremacy. He cannot absolve white Americans of a deformation they initiated in the nation's name, and this point holds even as he encourages, as Baldwin often encourages, black people to accept their white counterparts with love. Baldwin asks black Americans to love white people, but he also thinks this goes a long way in unburdening black people with responsibility for saving their white counterparts. Love, as we all know, is powerful. The work of civic love, like all loves, require partners. The love from black people may point the way to accepting one's past and is therefore important in that regard. Oh, I'm over time. But until they, referring to white Americans, until they can understand their history, they cannot be released from it. Time and history cannot serve in that role. Although time and history are useful in marking the temporal distance from one's beginnings, they cannot dissolve the inherited consequences of those actions. To be released from the past or forgiven for it, Baldwin says that they mean the same thing, is not the same as absolving one of the consequences of that past. In his conversation with Meade, he refers to those consequences that show themselves across time. He refers to this as the dynamic that exists in time. Those deeds are irrevocable, and they seeded the ethical and political life we now live and share. When Baldwin said this to Meade, she recoiled. Then we've nowhere to go, she says. And it would appear that we run into a problem. It now appears that Baldwin has seemingly traded in one origin story of America's greatness for another, that in abandoning the optimism of the American creed, he has embraced pessimism. And Baldwin says no, because we have, quote, atonement. To atone is to engage in reparative work. It orients the soul as one undertakes the work of correction, of improvement, of development. An atoning community looks backward to the beginning that has given life to the harms. It is perceptually attuned to how the harms ripple through time and engages in ameliorative actions so that those in the future may live more humanely in the light of their past. Atonement gives a specific meaning to our present actions in redressing racial inequalities and injustices that really contrast quite sharply with redemption. Redemption, and I say this very cautiously at a Catholic institution, redemption would aim to restore what was broken and deliver us from the harm that follows as a result. To be redeemed through Christ, to take the best example, is to be delivered from sin. The image of Christ on the cross is powerful and profound. It symbolizes the emptying of the self through sacrifice, offering humanity release from sin. Baldwin never invokes Christ in this role to address the tragedy of America's racial history. In fact, one might say Baldwin dispenses with the idea of redemption altogether, and we must do the same. It will give our democratic aspirations a more realistic grounding. As it stands now, our quest for national absolution through our politics is simply destructive. It leads us to attach too much value to victories of racial progress, and to read our historical success as redemption. It encourages us to believe it is permissible to monetize and materialize the reparative work of atonement. It deforms our relationship to history, leading us to believe that to study the past of slavery and racial injustice is to terrify and terrorize rather than empower American citizens. It obscures that reparations, for example, is an ongoing, never-ending struggle of bending the nation's will toward freedom and equality. It blinds us to the fact that responding to our racial history, similar to living our democracy, depends on what Baldwin says are choices, quote, we have got to make forever and ever and ever, every day, end quote. White supremacy for Baldwin, yes, is America's sin. Its source is historical, not metaphysical. It's rooted in this worldly choices. Some may bristle at the language of sin. But sin talk carries symbolic power. It signals a form of wrongdoing that runs deep, that has a way of not only touching the soul, but having a hand in the soul's construction. If the history of racial disregard lives in us, Baldwin insists that even our efforts to confront it affirmatively will only make sense because we embrace the past and remember the betrayal. Put differently, our gestures of redress, legal, political, and cultural, are intelligible only because they bear the trace of a stain we have inherited. We can atone for our racial crimes, but even in our reparative work, we remain haunted by the fatal betrayal, the fatal flaw, our sin. But there is, in this final moment, I think, there is enduring value in this perspective. This perspective envisions a society struggling to stay alert to the dangers of its racial past and attuned to how that past reveals itself in time. And this is why Baldwin describes confronting history as a battle. We do not find success in defeating the past, but in preventing it from becoming tyrannical. To be alive to our beginnings may allow us to begin again, wounds and all. We do not overcome our national trauma or secure salvation from our inheritance, but in the struggle, we may forge new senses of worth through words and deeds. This is community work, the hard work of democracy, and it can also be the darkened light of our faith, forged through the tragedy of our history. Thank you. I thought I was about to go get a cocktail early.
Thank you. Oh, wow, there we go. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I am very interested. You touched briefly on DEI and the current administration. And though I am trying to understand what's going on right now, like I'm sure a lot of us are all trying to understand what's going on right now, and though I understand that DEI spans well beyond race, to focus DEI on race right now, from your perspective, how would James Baldwin, how would the writers that you bring together, how do you think they might describe what's happening right now with the revoking of DEI?
Well, I think they would sort of see it as an attempt to describe efforts for inclusion and access, as attempts simply to engage in unfairness. Right? So in other words, they would say, oh, folks are being very slick, right? Baldwin would say, be careful, because what the attack on DEI is trying to do is to deform the intention behind it, right? Now, Baldwin would then wonder, and think out loud, I think, why is this the case, right? And I think the answer has to do with a segment of political elites on the right that are profoundly and deeply unsettled by the browning of America, about the ways in which they look out over a crowd and see ambiguously raced babies, right? And worry about what that means for their own status, right? The French thinker Tocqueville described this very nicely in Democracy in America, where he wondered, amid a certain elevated description of democracy, why do we still have, what's going on behind the persistence of slavery? And his argument is that, well, basically this is a kind of racial feudalism, and it is a way to affirm in white Americans their own authority. And Baldwin, many years later, advances the same claim. So I think that this is what these thinkers would say. Sidney Hook, I don't know what he would say.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. My question is about the end of The Fire Next, where James Baldwin refers to Noah and the Great Flood and describes how God gave the rainbow, but warns of the fire next. And my question is, do you interpret this moment as that fire beginning?
I don't know that kind of speculation is helpful. And the reason why I say that is because when we move into that domain, it means that democracy has really exhausted itself. In other words, that democracy has pointed toward its end, and it now requires a clearing of the ground for it to reassert itself. And I don't think, don't get me wrong, I think our present moment is dark. I don't know that we're there just yet.
Thank you.
Hi. That was one of my students. I forced my students to come here tonight. On that note, I had a kind of different question, but I think it's kind of in line with this one, so we'll start there. I think of the fire in terms of cycles, that it is not a particular moment that we arrive at. I think of it like Octavia Butler and the many prophecies that she has given us and that we are now experiencing at this very time. Particularly the section 2024 from Parable of the Sower, and that I hope we will not see the rest of that book happen, but if it does, well, that is simply where we are. With that in mind, I don't want to understand where we are as a particular moment, as you were just saying, but I'm wondering if you see these moments, perhaps, in cycles, and if there is a particular moment that we need to arrive at. If we're not there now, I'm not asking you to play God and tell us when we will get there, but how much further do we have to go? And once we arrive there, if that is a moment, or if it is another cycle of moments, my actual question that I had here was kind of, what do we do then? I have a much longer version of this question that I can ask, but I think you get my point.
Yeah. So here's what I would say is that the reason why I find it especially useful to make sure in my reading of Baldwin to emphasize the characterization, the fatal flaw as a sin, and the reason why it becomes important to characterize it as something that has a hand in the construction of the soul, the nation, right, the soul of the nation, is to do more than just simply flirt with the idea that this is the problem of American life that may not be going anywhere. And to then shift our focus away from reading our political and ethical and religious interventions, which should be there, to shift our focus from reading those as redemptive activities, as opposed to reading them as attempts to hold at bay the darkness that's inside of us, the nation. And to get us to see that then maybe we can measure the meaning of our worth to each other, our progress, not because we're solving something, but because of the effort that we're putting into it, right? Think about, and I'm gonna come to the other part of the question, think about relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, where there is, based on the relationship, some betrayal. But you decide to get on in that relationship. The formulation, I forgive, but I don't forget, right, is meant to track that something deep and profound has happened that fractured us, and that everything subsequent that will follow will be measured in some way by how we are managing this fracture, how we're managing this wound. And insofar as that relationship persists, it will be because we've looked at each other and said, wow, we're still trying, and trying counts for something. But to now deal with the other issue around the cycles, precisely because of the story about sin and thinking about race in these ways, we have these cycles. We have Reconstruction, then we have the collapse, right? We have what appeared to have been the browning of America and the shifting of political power in some ways. And then we have the emergence of MAGA, right? And that seems to be, I have reason to believe that will be that's what we do, right? In terms of the last bit, well, what would it take for us to arrive at the Baldwinian moment of the fire next time? We really got to do something to radically transform this place. I don't have an answer here, but I did find myself some weeks ago. I got up one morning and I found myself, true story, reaching for John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I wasn't teaching it. Why was I reaching for the Second Treatise of Government? Because there's this passage that Locke has, and I remembered it. I think it was in my dream. There's this passage he has where he is talking about revolution. And what Locke wants to do is hold off those who say, look, if you say that people are endowed with rights, any irritation from the government, they'll want to throw it off. Because after all, the value of the government is meant to be measured by how well it protects those rights. And Locke says, no. The people will endure a great many things without murmur or mutiny. And it is only when they feel the weight of the foot that is upon their neck and see where it really is all tending that they will rise up. Strikingly, if we think about the American colonists weren't bothered by the fact that they were ruled by a king. That didn't bother them. In the Declaration, it says that when the character of the king becomes tyrannical, when the king has acquired the character of a tyrant, you can now say that he is not fit to be the ruler of a free people. So again, somehow they arrived at a moment where the pain of that foot became clear. I don't know when we're going to arrive at that moment. Only we can decide when we will arrive at that moment. Right?
Follow-up question, Alex.
I clearly didn't get my fill last week of questions. All right, I'm curious for you. You talked about origin stories at the beginning, and I know from our conversations over the course of the past 2 weeks that this is something that really matters to you, is thinking about origin stories. And you suggested here, and you have elsewhere in your writing, that the appeal to origin stories tend to be necessarily disempowering because of the way that they suggest fatedness, and that even revisionist origin stories, for example, the 1619 Project, still trap us in a kind of vision of inescapable fate, right? And it's either that fate of redemption or the fatal flaw that you were talking about. And something that I'd love to hear you say something about is, do you think there's a vision of collective storytelling that can both acknowledge our history and facilitate political action in the present? Or do you think that our orientation needs to be one that does not focus on storytelling? So in other words, is the attempt to engage in collective storytelling itself the problem, or is there a mode of storytelling that we ought to be using?
Right. So that's a great question. All of us in this room make sense of our lives through stories. And sometimes there's stories about how our parents or our grandparents create the conditions for us to succeed and survive, and those are the stories that we tell ourselves around the holiday table, and they fortify us. And in our moments of darkness, we retreat to those stories to help remind us of the stock, dare I say, from which we come, right? There are also stories that we sometimes tell ourselves about bad things that have happened to us that serve to remind us of precisely the kinds of traits we don't want to acquire. And in that very way, through telling those dark stories, we shape a positive story for ourselves. Nations do the same thing. So telling ourselves stories, it seems to me, is inescapable. But the form we pick matters a great deal. And I tend to think that the way origin stories have worked in the United States, they have been disempowering, right? I mean, how many more times do we want to hear about the originalist, right? The original way the Constitution was written, and that served as the primary and exclusive lens for understanding law. They didn't know what problems we were dealing with, right? I mean, how many times do we want to hear that the beginnings of the United States are not only mired in slavery, but wholly capture the identity of the nation? Well, boy, you won't be able to move at all, right? So I think that these origin stories, the versions that are romantic, that we can really turn back to the founders because they knew the answers, and we need only turn to them and we can get it all right? Or these darker ones are really about our unwillingness to grapple with that central value that we claim to care about, which is freedom. Because freedom means, for James Baldwin, really being out there with nothing really under you. And nothing really under you doesn't mean that you don't have a history, but that the history is not going to be sufficient by itself for you to grapple with what's in front of you. And Baldwin thought that if we look at this in the right way, it can unleash our imagination. But for the vast majority of us, that's quite scary. Imagine if you discovered at this very moment that the identity that you claim for yourself every day, imagine if you could find out with certainty it's wrong. You would come undone. Remember those stories you were telling about mom and dad and grandpa and grandma around the table? Imagine if you found out none of it was true. Your knees would buckle. And that's a scary thing. And Baldwin thought that our preoccupation, or my reading of Baldwin, is that the preoccupation with origin stories is our unwillingness to grapple with the uncertainty that attends freedom, right? Precisely because I don't know who you are when I look at you and what you mean, I find it necessary to tell myself who you are and what you mean, as a way to help me remind myself of my own sovereignty, my own mastery, right? But of course, all this is an illusion because that's not who you are, right? And so my thought is, I'm not yet there in terms of an answer about, well, how ought we to think about the form? Minimally, I'm at the point where I think origin story is not the form. And then I have to figure it out. This is preoccupation with origin stories, which is in this paper, which closes my book, is the beginnings of a new project, in which I'm wondering just about this question, which is if we let go of origin stories, what else do we turn to in order to narrate our shared lives together? So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Was that okay? Was that sufficient? Okay. You know, but because the other thing I would say though about this origin story stuff is, think about the Civil War. Think about General Lee for the Confederacy. Think about General Grant for the Union. Imagine if I said, in my narration of American history, both heroes took to the battlefield. I would want to say something about this is not right. How we tell the story of our past is also a way of indicating what we value. And if I want to insist that both Lee and Grant are heroes, then I think others would be well within their rights to be very suspicious about whether or not I'm clear on the moral impermissibility of slavery. Right? And so, at some point, you're going to have to make a choice. We haven't let go of the facts. They both were involved in the Civil War. But the valuation that we attach to the characters there has everything to do with what we value, right? Not with what anyone else in the past valued, and what we value based on the kind of society we are trying to build for ourselves.
the slow push of the mic. Yeah, I think that's an excellent note for us to wrap up the evening. Thank you all so much for coming. Please join me in thanking Dr. Melvin Rogers. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. See y'all soon.